When a ruthless outlaw gang set its sights on a 93-year-old woman's beloved farm, they never imagined her Navy SEAL grandson would arrive to defend it. Yet that single act ignited a series of explosive confrontations, revealing corruption that extended far beyond a single town. We've already witnessed the high-stakes showdown on her property, one that forever changed the lives of everyone in the community. Want to know how they confronted danger head-on and exposed powerful figures? Be sure to listen through the whole story to discover every twist and turn. If you enjoy exciting stories with strong heroes and heartfelt community spirit, remember to subscribe to this channel. Your support means we can share even more remarkable tales just like this. Now let's move forward with our story as federal agents arrive, local volunteers band together, and the town braces for one final, unpredictable test. In the rugged highlands of western Montana lies the quiet town of Silver Hollow, known for its sweeping meadows and thick forests. A single dusty road splits off from the main highway, winding its way to a historic homestead owned by Margaret Ross, a 93-year-old matriarch who still rises at dawn to feed her chickens and inspect the fences. The sun's first rays illuminate the faded red barn, and the tall grass in the pasture shimmers with morning dew. For the better part of a century, her family has cultivated this land, struggling through harsh winters and meager harvests, yet always persisting with the unbreakable spirit that defines Montanans. Margaret treasures the place for the memories it holds, the laughter of her daughter learning to ride horses, the echoes of her husband's voice calling in the cattle, and even the first stumbling steps of her grandson, Ben Ross, who took his earliest walks right there in the dusty farmyard. Ben grew up to be no ordinary man. After finishing high school in Silver Hollow, he surprised his family by enlisting in the Navy, eventually earning a place in the elite ranks of the SEALs. Through countless deployments and over 200 missions, he became the embodiment of calm under pressure, forging a reputation for decisive leadership. Margaret brimmed with pride every time she heard from him, though her heart clenched with worry whenever he shipped off to another undisclosed region. He visited whenever his schedule allowed, drawn back by the farm's wide-open skies and the unwavering support of the grandmother who had partially raised him. That small-town tranquility, however, was a fragile thing. Over the past year, Margaret had noticed unusual changes in Silver Hollow. Strangers passed through more frequently, many sporting expensive SUVs and suits that didn't match the rural setting. Locals whispered about a gang of men calling themselves the Iron Hawks, led by a steely-eyed figure named Victor Hale, who seemed to arrive with all the swagger of a man who owned the place. Little by little, they purchased land, pressing old ranchers to sell under threats and intimidation. Those who refused encountered mysterious accidents, barn fires, vandalized crops, and livestock that inexplicably disappeared overnight. Stories circulated around the feed store and the diner that the Iron Hawks weren't your typical biker gang. They had well-organized connections, deep pockets, and a menacingly professional approach. Margaret's own troubles came to a head when Hale himself appeared one crisp morning, stepping out of a line of black SUVs that rumbled up the gravel drive. Flanked by a pair of bodyguards who moved with the disciplined grace of ex-military men, he sauntered up her porch stairs with a suspiciously friendly smile. He referred to himself as a real estate developer, bringing new life to a struggling region. Yet his smile never touched his eyes. Margaret had seen men like him before, self-assured predators who believed anyone beyond a certain age would be too weak or too frightened to resist. She offered them black coffee and a firm refusal, all while her mind whirred with dread. Something told her these men would return with less pleasant methods if a gentle nudge didn't work. Feeling the weight of the confrontation, she decided it was time to make a phone call she had hoped never to dial. To her grandson Ben, the only person who could face this threat head-on and stand a chance of prevailing. The morning after Hale's visit, Margaret lingered by the phone, summoning the nerve to call Ben. Her body still trembled from the silent menace in the Iron Hawk's parting glances. She replayed every unnerving detail of their visit, how Hale's guards had surveyed the farm like they were plotting coordinates, how Hale himself had spoken in a tone that balanced on the knife's edge between friendliness and threat. When he'd finally left, the roar of SUV engines kicked up a cloud of dust that lingered in the air, a haze that seemed symbolic of the uncertain future of the Ross homestead. She knew then she couldn't face these people alone. On the other end of the line, Commander Ben Ross answered immediately, his voice still carrying the crisp tension of a briefing room. Ben had just wrapped up a debrief for an overseas mission, yet the urgency in his grandmother's tone cut through any fatigue he might have felt. He listened calmly as Margaret recounted Hale's visit, how the man had insulted her age, implied that she'd be better off taking their generous offer, and most alarming, how he'd dared to make vague threats if she refused to sell. By the time Margaret finished speaking, Ben's tone had shifted to the quiet intensity that came over him whenever he sensed danger. He promised he'd be on the next flight out of Norfolk, claiming emergency leave to protect the only family he had left. The drive from the airport to Silver Hollow was a long one, best described as a blur of farmland and open fields racing by at high speed. Ben wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was Reggie Barnes, a fellow SEAL and longtime friend who insisted on tagging along the moment he heard an old woman was being menaced by hired muscle. Ben filled Reggie in on the local gossip gleaned from phone calls with Margaret and a few old friends around town. The Iron Hawks had a stranglehold on Silver Hollow's outskirts, leaning on small businesses for protection money. Anyone who refused found their livelihoods in jeopardy. The rumor mill also linked the gang to major drug channels coming in from the Canadian border. Their interest in farmland wasn't purely about land deals. It likely involved controlling trade routes and supply lines. They arrived under the fading summer light, crossing the boundary into Silver Hollow, just as neon signs clicked off along Main Street. The smell of pine and fresh air should have been comforting, but an oppressive aura seemed to hang in the air. You could feel it in the way people glanced out from behind curtained windows, or the way a passing deputy's patrol car slowed suspiciously. As Ben neared the farm, he spotted fresh tire tracks on the dusty road, a foreboding sign of recent uninvited visitors. The farm itself, though worn by seasons of labor, still rose proud against the amber skyline. The old fence posts, the squeaking weather vane, and the peeling paint on the barn were all testaments to a life built through sweat and grit. Stepping out of the vehicle, Ben felt a surge of resolve. He would not allow fear to steal away his family's legacy. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret was in the kitchen, calmly preparing supper like she had done thousands of times before. The scent of onion and thyme on sizzling butter filled the air. Age had weathered her face with fine lines, but her gaze burned with a resilient spirit. As soon as Ben stepped through the screen door, she put down her wooden spoon and embraced him tightly. The warmth of her grip belied the fact that her hands had been trembling, not hours ago. After greeting Reggie, she led them to the oak dining table that had been in the Ross family for generations. It bore a few scars of its own, scratches, burn marks, rings left by hot pots, signs of the hardships this family had endured. Over dinner, Margaret explained all she knew about the Iron Hawks. Their sudden appearance had been preceded by big talk of development opportunities and modernizing the region. Victor Hale, their charismatic and sharp-dressed ringleader, had used intimidation disguised as business proposals. At first, he had approached smaller landowners on the outskirts, some of whom accepted payouts they could scarcely refuse. Those who declined soon found their equipment vandalized or their barns on fire. The local law enforcement felt powerless, either outgunned, paid off, or simply too scared to push back. A once close-knit town now tiptoed around the presence of these gangsters. It terrified her to imagine they might do the same, or worse, to her farm. Ben listened intently, occasionally glancing over at Reggie. They'd both seen such tactics before in conflict zones overseas, where private militias or rogue factions coerced villagers into surrendering strategic land. But to witness it happening here, in the heartland of America, in the very town where he'd grown up, was something else entirely. When Margaret finished talking, Ben promised that he wasn't just here to mount a symbolic stand, he was here to root them out. If the Iron Hawks truly had paramilitary and narcotics ties, then their operation likely extended beyond petty intimidation. Taking them down wouldn't be a one-man job. It would require a coalition, perhaps not a formal military one, but rather the latent strength of a community galvanized by the right leadership. They left the farmhouse to drive into Silver Hollow proper, seeking a late-night meeting with Sheriff Emily Brooks, one of the few law enforcement officers Margaret still trusted. The local sheriff's department occupied a modest brick building that looked more like a repurposed library than a modern station. The single floodlight in the parking lot cast a lonely glow. Inside, Emily Brooks was at her desk, poring over scattered paperwork. She was a woman in her early 40s, her brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Her expression, as she studied the files, was one of weary perseverance. A pistol and a radio lay to her right, symbols of authority that might not be enough in the face of a well-organized operation. When Ben and Reggie introduced themselves, Emily's face lit with relief. She greeted Ben by name, recalling how she'd watched him play high school baseball and how proud the town had been when he joined the Navy. The burden of dealing with the Iron Hawks alone visibly weighed on her. Sitting them down, she recounted the official side of the crisis: unsolved arsons, suspicious property transfers, and a string of accidents that seemed to follow anyone who crossed Hale. Trying to stand against a highly funded, well-connected ring was akin to swimming against a riptide, and the department was understaffed and outgunned. Her best deputies, she suspected, had been lured away, transferred, or intimidated. The gravity in her voice underscored the severity of Silver Hollow's predicament. Before dawn the next morning, Ben and Reggie quietly set to work. Their first stop was Harvey Goodwin's Diner, the heart of Silver Hollow's Main Street, in a place where real news circulated faster than any official report. The diner opened at 5 to serve groggy ranchers, bleary truckers, and insomniac writers, all hoping to get a coffee fix. The walls were decorated with vintage posters for old rodeos and carnival fairs. A large American flag hung near the entrance, proudly commemorating local veterans. Despite the cheery decor, a somber hush blanketed the handful of customers hunched over their steaming mugs. Harvey Goodwin, a balding man in his late 60s who owned the diner, recognized Ben right away. "I was wondering when you'd come home," he said, sliding a fresh pot of coffee onto the table. Under normal circumstances, Harvey might have asked about Ben's Navy tours or reminisced about the time Ben had been the star pitcher for the high school baseball team. But today, there was only one topic on people's minds: the Iron Hawks. The fear was palpable, but so was a flicker of hope now that a Navy SEAL and his comrade had arrived. Over the next hour, local ranchers and small business owners trickled in, whispering accounts of property pressure, protection fees, and open threats. One of the men, a wiry rancher with sun-etched wrinkles named Clayton Rowe, described how he'd awoken to the stench of burning oil only to find his tractor torched in the silhouettes of strangers drifting away into the dark. Another patron mentioned overhead drones buzzing at night, suggesting a level of surveillance more advanced than typical hooliganism. Harvey kept refilling their mugs, shaking his head at the mounting evidence of an organized ring. After gathering as much intel as they could, Ben thanked Harvey, promising he and Reggie would do everything possible to help. They returned to the station to compare notes with Sheriff Brooks. As they pieced together the puzzle, patterns began to emerge: coordinated landbys near highways leading north to the Canadian border, large shipments of unidentified cargo, and a network of shell companies funneling cash into local political channels. All indications were that Victor Hale's Iron Hawks were just the tip of something bigger. Hale's nominal identity as a real estate developer looked more like a front to launder money from drug running or weapon smuggling. He had the muscle, the capital, and apparently no moral compunction about destroying livelihoods for a strategic foothold. Reggie suggested they bring in federal agencies, FBI or DEA. Sheriff Brooks had tried, but her repeated requests got mysteriously lost in bureaucratic choke points. She suspected that powerful people in the state capitol might be shielding Hale and his crew. Frustrated but not defeated, they concluded that local solutions might be the only immediate recourse. If the system was compromised, they'd need to rely on the integrity of individuals, like the good folks in Silver Hollow, who hadn't been bullied or bought. And in this uncertain landscape, they had something money couldn't buy: a willingness to protect their own, no matter the risk. That evening, Ben and Reggie began conducting their own reconnaissance. They borrowed an old pickup truck from Margaret and drove up a winding dirt trail to a vantage point overlooking the newly purchased farmland just west of town. Through a pair of high-powered binoculars, they observed a sprawling site that had once been the Fremont Cattle Ranch. Now it bore the distinct markings of an Iron Hawk stronghold. Towering floodlights illuminated the perimeter. Armed guards, some wearing motorcycle cuts, others in plain clothes but standing with suspiciously upright posture, moved in deliberate patterns. The property's barn doors were conspicuously padlocked, and the faint glow of security monitors flickered behind tinted windows. Ben frowned. The whole setup reminded him of clandestine operations he'd seen overseas. Hale's men radiated discipline. These weren't just run-of-the-mill bullies, but ex-military or private security contractors. They appeared ready for confrontation at a moment's notice. Their vehicles included not just sleek SUVs, but also cargo vans capable of hauling significant loads. Any illusions that this was just a small-time gang rapidly dissolved. Reggie pointed out multiple vantage points guarded by men with night vision goggles. It was no wonder local ranchers felt powerless. They were up against a paramilitary outfit in their own backyard. Returning to the farm, Ben shared his findings with Margaret. He tried to keep his voice calm, not wanting to alarm her more than necessary. She responded with a quiet determination that surprised even him. "Well, if they're that serious, so are we," she said, her sharp blue eyes showing not a trace of fear. She believed in standing her ground, confident that giving in only encouraged bullies. Margaret had faced her share of hardships in life, a Great Depression childhood, the loss of her husband, the challenge of keeping the farm profitable through recessions. She would not bow to intimidation now. The next day, Margaret received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Inside was a terse letter stating she'd failed to comply with new county agricultural regulations and that her farm faced immediate closure pending an environmental review. The letter was signed by William Fletcher, a county commissioner whose name had popped up multiple times in rumors of crooked dealings. Margaret calmly showed it to Ben, who suspected this was the Iron Hawks' latest move, using bureaucratic red tape to squeeze out the last holdouts. Sheriff Brooks confirmed their suspicions. Fletcher had been pushing through suspicious zoning changes for months, all while ignoring calls to investigate property damage linked to Hale's group. Official channels were getting nowhere. The Iron Hawks had grown brazen enough to try to close farmland that had operated for nearly a century under the Ross family name. "They've made a critical error," Margaret said, a hint of grim satisfaction in her tone. "If they push me into a corner, I'm coming out fighting." For a moment, Ben flashed back to childhood memories of his grandmother scolding him for leaving the barn door open in a storm. That same unwavering resolve that would not be trifled with. This time, though, the stakes were immeasurably higher. Silver Hollow's tension reached a boiling point when the Iron Hawks started flexing their muscle more openly. Several shops on Main Street, those refusing to sell or pay protection, were vandalized under the cover of darkness. Windows were smashed, locks tampered with, and insulting graffiti scrawled on doors. One of the hardest hit was Paula Green's General Store, a fixture of the community that Paula had inherited from her parents. The morning after the vandalism, Ben and Reggie joined Sheriff Brooks in interviewing Paula. Trembling with anger, she pointed at the shattered glass counters and damaged shelves. The losses would be devastating if her insurance decided to pull the rug out from under her due to criminal activity clauses. Word traveled fast. By midday, local ranchers and business owners organized a meeting at Harvey Goodwin's diner to discuss collective action. More people showed up than the diner could hold comfortably. Ranchers in muddy boots, store owners still wearing aprons from the day's work, even elderly residents who rarely left their homes. The hubbub of voices settled into grim silence when Ben stood up, the slight clink of his dog tags accentuating the hush. He laid out a plan. Gather evidence of the Iron Hawks' harassment, compile it, and share it in a coordinated manner so that no single individual could be easily singled out for retaliation. They would also form a volunteer patrol schedule, with locals rotating to keep watch at night over the most vulnerable properties. Sheriff Brooks agreed to coordinate, ensuring that those patrolling had the legal right to do so. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would at least put a check on the gang's fear tactics. People seemed to draw courage from each other's presence. No one had dared suggest such measures before, but watching a Navy SEAL vow to defend them instilled a newfound boldness. The meeting ended with hushed optimism. For the first time in months, the townsfolk realized they weren't entirely alone. However, that night, the Iron Hawks set Jesse Palmer's truck on fire. Jesse, a mechanic who had just volunteered to help with night patrols, ran outside in time to see a dark figure spray paint the side of his shop before speeding off on a motorcycle. Flames licked at the old Chevy's hood, and as Jesse scrambled with a fire extinguisher, The incident rattled the new coalition. Was their renewed courage already drawing a retaliation? Ben and Reggie arrived minutes later, Reggie's eyes scanning the darkness with a practiced vigilance. They found footprints in the gravel and a partially intact set of tire tracks leading onto a side street. Nothing conclusive, but perhaps enough for some forensic leads. Jesse, still clutching the fire extinguisher, looked shaken yet resolute. If they think this'll scare me into crawling away, they're wrong, he muttered. Despite the destruction and threat, an undercurrent of resolve hummed through the small group of onlookers who gathered. If the Iron Hawks aimed to force people into terrified compliance, they might discover a community that had finally decided it would stand on its feet and fight back. Under the canopy of a star-speckled sky, Ben and Reggie embarked on a deeper investigation into the Iron Hawks' activities, enlisting the help of an investigative journalist named Jessica Alvarez. Jessica had been following the gang's trail for months, connecting dots across county lines. She arrived in Silver Hollow in an inconspicuous compact car, armed with a laptop brimming with files. Over coffee at Harvey's Diner, she laid out evidence suggesting that the Iron Hawks were a well-oiled machine with ties to international cartels. Jessica showed them photos of battered trucks crossing from Canada into Montana, documented with special license plates that traced back to shell companies. She presented bank statements linking Commissioner Fletcher to unaccounted-for cash deposits that matched known payoff patterns. Then came the most damning images. Inside one of Hale's supposedly abandoned barns were crates with suspicious markings, likely containing weapons or drugs. No local authority had dared to investigate, and every time she tried to pass her findings to higher enforcement, the leads turned cold. Sheriff Brooks arrived mid-presentation, bringing maps of the county's old logging and mining roads. She suspected the Iron Hawks used these secluded paths to traffic goods while bypassing border checkpoints. With these maps, Jessica's photos, and the community's testimonies, they had a dossier robust enough to spark federal interest. If only they could find an agency that hadn't been compromised or was willing to act without higher-level sabotage. Amid the flurry of documents, an unexpected visitor strolled into the diner. Mitch Yates, a high-ranking member of the Iron Hawks and reputedly Victor Hale's right-hand man. He locked eyes with Ben, whose presence had become something of an open secret in town. A hush fell over the diner as Mitch approached their booth, shoulders squared and face contorted in faux friendliness. "Ben Ross, right? Heard you've been busy asking questions." His voice, though calm, dripped with challenge. He cast a quick, dismissive glance at Jessica and Sheriff Brooks. "We're simple businessmen. It'd be a shame if folks misconstrued our intentions and got themselves hurt." Ben stared back, unflinching, and introduced himself in a level tone. "Just making sure my grandmother can keep her farm. You wouldn't know anything about people trying to force her off it, would you?" Mitch's grin became a sneer. "We've got big plans for Silver Hollow. Standing in our way could cause problems. Sometimes accidents happen. No one wants that, especially not to a sweet old lady." Sheriff Brooks stood, about to intervene, but Ben gently waved her off, meeting Mitch's gaze with an unwavering intensity. "Threatening my family is your second mistake," he said quietly. "The first was coming to this town." The tension was a tangible force that pressed upon every diner patron. After a moment of silence, Mitch let out a short bark of laughter and stepped on back. "You might want to rethink your approach," he advised. "Just watch your step. That's all." He pivoted and headed for the exit, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. Harvey, who had been refilling sugar containers, sighed heavily. "They're testing you," he murmured, setting a sugar jar down with a tremor. "They're testing all of us." As if in response to Mitch's warning, the Iron Hawks escalated their efforts to isolate Margaret Ross and anyone aiding her cause. 2 nights after the diner confrontation, county officials, likely under Fletcher's directive, placed a condemnation notice on Margaret's barn, citing a range of dubious code violations. In broad daylight, utility workers arrived to disconnect the farm's electricity, claiming non-payment for bills that Margaret had proof of paying. Sheriff Brooks tried to intervene, but her objections were stonewalled by convoluted legalese and forged paperwork. During the aftermath of that altercation, Margaret's resilience shone. She refused to abandon her livestock, lighting her kerosene lamps to continue working through the dark. Neighbors quietly dropped off generators and extension cords to keep critical systems running. The local volunteer fire department chief discreetly arranged for a water truck to top off her cisterns. Acts of solidarity like these became the backbone of Silver Hollow's resistance. Each new wave of intimidation met by a growing chorus of defiance. Meanwhile, Ben and Reggie devised a plan to gather incriminating evidence directly from inside the Iron Hawks operation. They learned through Jessica that the gang was expecting a large shipment, likely smuggled from across the border, to arrive via back roads near an abandoned sawmill. If they could capture photographic or video proof of the exchange, they'd have a game changer. Under the cover of night, they staked out the sawmill. With a vantage point on a rocky hillside, they waited, night vision cameras at the ready. Around midnight, headlights pierced the darkness. A convoy of 3 SUVs and 2 large trucks pulled in, flanked by armed men. Their actions were too disciplined to be random thugs. Equipment checks, guard rotations, signals passed via radio. Ben managed to capture clear footage of men unloading crates from the trucks, crates marked with symbols associated with known cartel activities. Reggie got close enough to snap still photos of the license plates. They also recognized Hale himself stepping from an SUV, scanning the surroundings as if wary of hidden observers. The look on his face, a mixture of confidence and paranoia, confirmed the worst of their suspicions. This was no mere land grab. It was an international criminal network thriving under the guise of real estate deals. Emboldened by this success, Ben and Reggie retreated before dawn, carefully transferring the recordings to multiple secure drives to ensure the evidence wouldn't be easily destroyed. Jessica planned to distribute the material to contacts in major news outlets and federal agencies outside the state to bypass local political corruption. Yet they all knew that going public meant painting a giant target on their backs. Hale's operation would not meekly fold once exposed. Cornered predators tend to lash out. If anything, the revelations would provoke them to stamp out Silver Hollow's burgeoning resistance with renewed ruthlessness. Still, that glimmer of hope, that truth might finally see the light of day, fueled their determination. They'd pulled back the curtain on the Iron Hawks. The question now was whether the community could withstand the inevitable backlash. As dawn broke over Silver Hollow, the tension in the air felt almost electric. The first to feel the Iron Hawk's wrath was Paula Green, who awoke to find her general store set ablaze. Though firefighters rushed to contain the flames, much of her livelihood was reduced to ash by the time the sun fully rose. Paula stood on the sidewalk in tears, soot smeared on her cheeks, as neighbors tried to console her. Sheriff Brooks surveyed the scene with clenched fists, suspecting arson but lacking immediate proof. That suspicion was soon validated when Jessica discovered a planted gas canister in the rubble, reeking of accelerants that matched other suspicious blazes. Margaret Ross, learning of the fire, felt her anger kindle. Enough of these silent nights filled with destruction. People had lost property, their sense of security, and even the joys of small-town life. The Iron Hawks were turning once peaceful farmland into a war zone. Over the radio, local ranchers declared themselves ready to stand guard at night, rotating shifts to protect at-risk properties. Some had served in the military or had grown up hunting in these woods. They understood firearms and strategy to a degree that made them formidable defenders. "We won't let them keep burning us out," declared a retired Marine named Craig Dennison, offering his farmland as a coordination point. While the volunteer militia formed, Ben, Reggie, and Jessica prepared for the next phase. Releasing their collected evidence to mainstream media and federal agencies they believed untainted by local corruption. Jessica's contact at a major newspaper promised an expose, but it would take time to vet the material and prepare a legally airtight story. In the interim, the trio shared shorter video snippets on social media through encrypted accounts, hoping to draw broader public attention. The snippets showed armed men unloading crates by the sawmill and revealed the intimidation tactics used by local officials to strong-arm farmers. The response was immediate. Thousands of viewers expressed outrage, retweeting and commenting, while local politicians scrambled to do damage control. Hale reacted predictably. That afternoon, a group of Iron Hawks thugs roughed up Jesse Palmer outside his workshop, fracturing his wrist. The men barked a message while pinning him against a wall. "Tell your SEAL friend and that busybody journalist to back off, or next time we won't be so gentle." They left him bruised and battered, but resolute. From his hospital bed, Jesse insisted he'd keep volunteering to defend the town. "They can't beat all of us," he muttered, wincing in pain. "And they sure can't kill the truth." This wave of escalating violence galvanized the town further. Even those previously on the fence now openly supported Margaret. A line of pickup trucks formed a convoy along her road, offering supplies and muscle. She welcomed them with open arms, organizing a schedule so that at any given hour someone was watching the gates, the barn, and the perimeter. In doing so, they turned the Ross homestead into a fortress of communal resistance. The Iron Hawks, so used to exploiting fear, now faced a populace that drew courage from solidarity. A showdown loomed on the horizon, and both sides knew it was just a matter of time before it broke like a thunderstorm over Montana's wide skies. The showdown finally arrived on a cool autumn evening when the Iron Hawks converged on the Ross homestead in a caravan of SUVs, headlights sweeping the fields like searchlights. Margaret, seated inside with a shotgun across her lap, peered out through the window. The newly installed floodlights around the barn illuminated the yard, giving just enough light for the volunteer guards to see any intruders. Ben, Reggie, and three other volunteers were strategically positioned behind stacks of hay bales and old farm equipment, each vantage point offering a clear line of sight to the driveway. An eerie silence clung to the air, pierced only by the distant hum of engines. When the SUVs halted, Victor Hale emerged, wearing a tailored jacket and radiating the poise of a businessman. He surveyed the scene with cold eyes, noticing the armed volunteers arrayed in defensive positions. His men followed, stepping out with rifles at the ready. Hale's voice rang out across the yard, amplified by the stillness of the night. "Margaret Ross, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Take our offer and you can walk away a wealthy woman. Why risk everything over a piece of dirt?" Ben was the one to reply, stepping from behind a tractor to stand in the glow of a floodlight. "Because this land isn't yours to steal, because people in this town aren't giving up their homes to criminals." His voice was calm, but carried lethal conviction. Hale smirked. "Criminals?" he repeated mockingly. "We're visionaries, Commander Ross. You of all people should understand strategic advantage. This farm is a critical point for the future, and you're in our way." Moments later, a single gunshot shattered the night, though it was unclear who fired first. The volunteer defenders held their ground, returning controlled bursts of fire whenever an Iron Hawks operative darted forward. Sheriff Brooks, having been tipped off about the possible clash, arrived with her deputies, sirens cutting through the darkness. Jessica Alvarez's camera captured footage from the relative safety of a nearby outbuilding, broadcasting the standoff live to an audience that had grown internationally overnight. Despite the chaos, Hale tried to keep a veneer of control. His men spread out, attempting to flank the defenders. Ben and Reggie coordinated the volunteers with swift hand signals. They had set up strobing spotlights to disrupt night vision equipment, while also creating quarters of darkness where they could maneuver unseen. Their tactics, combined with the volunteers' familiarity with the terrain, kept the Iron Hawks from gaining any real advantage. Gunfire echoed off the barn walls, muzzle flashes lighting up the dusty air. But for all their high-tech gear, Hale's men found themselves stymied by a humble farming community turned fierce. The firefight ended abruptly when Hale, realizing the risk of staying longer, ordered a retreat. Engines roared to life as the SUVs pulled back, leaving plumes of dust in their wake. Wounded members of both sides groaned in the yard, and volunteers hurried to administer first aid. Ben's heart hammered in his chest, but relief washed over him as he confirmed that Margaret was safe, huddled in the farmhouse with her shotgun still in hand. In that moment, it felt like a victory, but everyone knew that the Iron Hawks would regroup. The events of the night had transformed a local property dispute into a full-scale war for the soul of Silver Hollow. In the days following the skirmish, Silver Hollow resembled a town under siege. The Iron Hawks, humiliated but not defeated, doubled down on their psychological warfare. Leaflets began circulating, warning residents to stay out of matters that don't concern them. Phone lines crackled with anonymous threats, and rumors spread that reinforcements were inbound. More mercenaries hired by Hale through his cartel connections. Bullet holes and shattered glass marred the Ross farm, disquieting reminders of how close they'd all come to tragedy. Margaret showed no signs of cowing to intimidation. She oversaw repairs to her barn, organizing volunteers into shifts, to patch up bullet-ridden walls and mend fences. Meanwhile, Ben and Reggie conducted after-action reviews with Sheriff Brooks, gleaning lessons from the nighttime clash. They strengthened strategic points, sought additional medical supplies, and made sure the civilians on patrol had at least basic first aid and firearms training. The dedication of everyday townspeople was astonishing. Folks who'd never held a gun now took target practice, guided by ex-military ranchers or hunters with specialized know-how. While the physical defenses shored up, Jessica Alvarez continued her media campaign. The standoff footage she captured went viral, picked up by national news outlets. Her subsequent interviews put a spotlight on the Iron Hawks' violent takeover attempts, exposing the complicity of certain county officials. Public opinion swayed heavily against Hale, and the heat on state authorities mounted. At first, local politicians tried to dismiss Jessica as an agitator, but as more evidence trickled out, financial statements, shell company records, and eyewitness accounts, the stonewalling began to crack. An even bigger break arrived when a truck driver, coerced into transporting cartel shipments for Hale, turned himself in to the sheriff. In exchange for protection and immunity, he named names and provided documentation of the gang's operations, from narcotics distribution to money laundering. This testimony aligned perfectly with Jessica's own research and promised to blow the case wide open. Sheriff Brooks hurriedly shared the new intel with a federal contact outside the state lines, someone she believed to be trustworthy, far enough from local corruption to act decisively. If the feds moved quickly, they could coordinate a sting operation that might uproot Hale's entire enterprise. However, the Iron Hawks had their own eyes and ears. Word of the impending federal interest reached Hale, who swiftly called in every favor he had. Soldiers of fortune began arriving in Silver Hollow, blending in with the bikers and ex-military types already prowling the back roads. Locals reported black SUV caravans quietly rolling in at odd hours, as though preparing for something ominous. The stakes soared beyond a rural land dispute. Silver Hollow, once known for its placid pine groves and robust farmland, had become a battlefield in a nationwide war against organized crime. And at the center of it all stood the Ross homestead, symbol of a community's defiance, a place that offered either the final stand against tyranny or a potential catalyst for wide-ranging reforms. The clock ticked down, each day's passing, bringing them closer to the next reckoning. In the aftermath of the nighttime firefight on the Ross homestead, Silver Hollow found itself teetering on the brink of outright conflict. The Iron Hawks retreated, but their lingering presence was felt in every corner store, every diner booth, and every hushed conversation by the gas pumps. Bullet holes peppered the Ross barn, a sobering reminder that Victor Hale and his men weren't idle threats. In response, local volunteers redoubled their efforts, taking shifts around the farm and along the roads leading into town. You could see them at night, scattered silhouettes against the moonlit plains, each carrying the weighty knowledge that one misstep could trigger more bloodshed. Margaret Ross, though still shaken by the brazen assault, refused to let fear take root. Barely a day after the shooting, she was outside tacking up fresh boards where bullets had splintered the barn. Neighbors came with tools and lumber, offering to help. Some hammered away in determined silence, while others exchanged grim stories of intimidation they'd faced. Despite the tension, there was a palpable sense that solidarity was building. Each patch of new wood in the barn, each repaired fence post, felt like a small victory against the forces trying to uproot them. Meanwhile, Ben Ross and Reggie Barnes coordinated more closely than ever with Sheriff Emily Brooks. They used an empty classroom in the abandoned wing of the local school as their makeshift command center. Maps of the county plastered the walls, studded with colored pushpins marking suspected Iron Hawk safe houses, vantage points, and smuggling routes that veered north toward the Canadian border. Harvesting every bit of intelligence they'd collected, photos, video, testimonies, the trio pieced together a mosaic that told a terrifyingly expansive story of criminal enterprise. Hale and his immediate gang were only a fraction of a larger chain, one that extended into state politics and overseas cartels. Complicating matters further, local officials continued to issue spurious citations against Margaret's property. Every day seemed to bring a new inspection that declared her well water contaminated, or her barn structurally unsafe, or her cattle feed mislabeled. Each notice was penned by the office of Commissioner William Fletcher. More troubling were the newly formed alliances between Fletcher and certain state agencies, all but guaranteeing that any official complaint filed by Sheriff Brooks would be delayed indefinitely. Feeling the pressure, folks in Silver Hollow began to wonder if their efforts to fight back might be crushed beneath layers of red tape and bribed public servants. Yet even with these challenges, momentum was shifting. Jessica Alvarez's investigative work had gone viral, aided by the harrowing footage of the Homestead clash. Cable news outlets replayed the nighttime exchange, debating whether local militias were heroes or vigilantes. Some painted the conflict as a standoff that threatened to escalate beyond a single county, while others hailed Silver Hollow as an example of a community taking back its power from a criminal network. The one consistent takeaway was that these events had thrust Victor Hale's operation and its many political enablers under a national spotlight, a place where secrets rarely stay hidden for long. Several days later, the tension tightened like a piano wire ready to snap. The Iron Hawks seemed emboldened by reinforcements, tough-looking newcomers with out-of-state license plates, men whose hands and postures suggested military backgrounds. They brought in more weaponry too, including assault rifles and body armor. From what Ben and Reggie could glean through nighttime surveillance, Hale had brokered new deals with powerful interests, some rumored to be tied directly to narcotics cartels that saw Silver Hollow as a vital corridor. The intelligence pointed to a multi-state pipeline of contraband running from Canada all the way to southern distribution hubs, with Silver Hollow perfectly placed to oversee the routes. Margaret Ross got wind of these developments from various neighbors who'd seen ominous convoys passing her farm. Although the thought of heavier weaponry and more mercenaries would terrify anyone, she channeled her anxiety into practicality. She made a list of all the farm equipment and supplies that might be needed if the standoff turned even more violent. Diesel for the generators, extra lanterns, medical kits stocked with more bandages and antiseptics. These became her focus. The mere act of preparing, of inventorying her resources, helped stave off the helplessness that threatened to creep in. Simultaneously, Sheriff Brooks found herself juggling investigations and political roadblocks. Her phone rang endlessly, out-of-town reporters requesting interviews, concerned citizens sharing rumors, and county officials chastising her for overstepping jurisdiction. It was a bureaucratic game designed to wear her down, to stop her from acting effectively. But she had allies. Newly emboldened deputies who were sick of seeing their town bullied volunteered for extra shifts, forming what Brooks called a rapid response unit. It was a fancy title for a half-dozen officers with borrowed gear, but it was better than nothing. Jessica Alvarez, on the other hand, pursued leads that traced money flows deeper into the state capital. She called in every favor and contact she had. Through a labyrinth of shell corporations, the funds propping up the Iron Hawks operation led to influential state figures. Here was the real crux of the matter. Hale's local intimidation campaign was but one gear in a massive machine run by men who profited from fear. The deeper Jessica dug, the clearer it became that these bigger players didn't care about farmland for farmland's sake. They cared about controlling key distribution channels. Margaret's century-old homestead was simply the next cog in their route. In response to this new intel, Ben and Reggie ramped up their plan to secure federal help. Armed with Jessica's documentation, they reached out to contacts in the DEA and the FBI, people they'd met through past missions or investigative cooperations. The challenge was ensuring their evidence reached honest hands, untainted by the political strings these cartels could pull. Time was running short, especially with the Iron Hawks bolstering their numbers. The slightest misstep in choosing an ally could lead to a leak that would tip Hale off, resulting in an even faster, potentially deadlier clampdown on the town. Every day, the stakes ballooned, leaving everyone involved bracing for a final collision that could shatter Silver Hollow or ultimately set it free. Night fell on Silver Hollow in a hush of expectation. A crisp wind stirred the pine needles, and the stars shone with a cold brilliance, as if bracing for the violence that might erupt below. At the Ross homestead, a cluster of volunteers, ranchers, shopkeepers, retired military, huddled around kerosene lamps, drinking coffee from thermoses and reviewing watch rotations. Their presence offered a semblance of security, yet the tension in their eyes was undeniable. Some had never held a rifle until a week prior. Now they carried them like lifelines, hearts pounding every time a truck rumbled by in the darkness. Margaret stepped onto her porch with a lantern, scanning the yard. She could see the flicker of headlights on the distant highway. One of the watchers, a young man named Trevor, who used to run the local hardware store, raised a hand in greeting. She waved back, a silent acknowledgement of shared resolve. Inside the farmhouse, Ben pored over a map of the county. He'd circled spots where iron hawks had been sighted. Old logging roads, hidden trailheads, outlying barns. Reggie tapped each location, pointing out patterns in the distribution of forces. It looked as though Hale was establishing a perimeter, possibly planning a coordinated strike from multiple directions. While the men studied the map, Margaret brewed another pot of coffee and brought out sandwiches, determined that no one standing guard on her land would go hungry. She couldn't shake the memory of the earlier firefight, how bullets had shattered the stillness of her home. The fear gnawed at her, but so did a steely pride in seeing her neighbors stand alongside her. As she handed Ben a plate, she recalled her husband's stories of serving in World War II, the times he'd spoken of unity forged under duress, of how hardship tested the character of an entire generation. She suspected Silver Hollow was on the cusp of a similar test. Shortly after midnight, a text message buzzed on Jessica Alvarez's phone. She'd been staying at the farm for her own safety, protected by the volunteer guard. The message came from a confidential FBI contact in another state. It read, "Confirmed infiltration. Agents en route. ETA 24-48 hours. Keep location secure." Jessica's eyes lit up. This could be the break they needed. Federal agents not compromised by local or state-level corruption, armed with enough legal authority to dismantle the operation. She relayed the news to Ben, who reacted with cautious optimism. Federal backing might tip the scales, but only if they could hold out until the agents arrived. Reggie proposed a plan: stage a diversion that might force the Iron Hawks to commit resources prematurely, splitting their forces and buying time. Ben agreed, noting that if Hale believed an immediate crackdown was happening, he might move before he was fully ready. The plan was risky. It meant antagonizing a well-armed gang further. But with federal help on the horizon, the advantage lay in controlling the timing of the next confrontation. In this cat-and-mouse game, the side that chose when to pounce often held the winning hand. So, with adrenaline still coursing through their veins, they agreed to set the trap at dawn, each silently hoping they could outmaneuver the Iron Hawks' lethal ambition. Their diversion plan hinged on creating enough noise to spook Hale into revealing his bigger tactics. At first light, Reggie and a few volunteers left in two old pickup trucks, loaded with scrap metal and farming equipment to make them look innocuous. Their destination, a seldom-used logging trail near the foothills, about 3 miles from the largest Iron Hawks outpost. The idea was to appear as though they were erecting barricades or preparing for some kind of retaliatory ambush. Jessica tagged along to document every move, capturing photos that could be circulated on local social media within minutes. By mid-morning, they began hammering posts into the ground, piling debris, and making a public show of defiance. The racket echoed through the valleys, metal hitting metal, engines revving, men shouting instructions. Meanwhile, a drone covertly launched from behind the Ross barn circled overhead, feeding live video to Ben's laptop. Sure enough, the Iron Hawks picked up on the commotion. Through the drone's lens, Ben watched a convoy of black SUVs peel out of their hideouts, heading for the logging trail with dust billowing behind them. It was exactly what they wanted, to draw away a chunk of Hale's manpower while leaving other angles lightly defended. Simultaneously, Margaret's farm remained braced for any potential counterstrike. Sheriff Brooks stationed her most reliable deputies at strategic checkpoints around the homestead's perimeter. They tested radio frequencies to ensure they could maintain contact in case the Iron Hawks tried to jam signals. In the kitchen, Margaret fixed sandwiches and extra coffee, an almost domestic gesture clashing with the raw tension that gripped the property. She checked the condition of the storm cellar, remembering it as a place she once used to store canned peaches and vegetables. Now it might serve as a last refuge if the worst happened. At the logging trail, the standoff manifested faster than expected. 3 SUVs screeched to a halt in a semicircle, doors flying open. Men jumped out, brandishing rifles. Reggie kept his hands visible, stepping forward slowly. Jessica filmed from behind the relative cover of a rusted tractor part, One of the gunmen, wearing tinted aviators, barked at them to clear out or face immediate consequences. Reggie, ever calm, informed them that this land was private property, part of a ranch whose owner refused to sell. The tension skyrocketed when the gunman demanded that Reggie and the volunteers step away from the barricades. The volunteers retreated in small steps, acting intimidated yet still capturing the entire encounter on hidden cameras. Though voices rose and rifles shifted aggressively, Reggie didn't see the point in pushing them into a firefight there and then. The main goal was to keep them distracted. From all appearances, the gamble worked. The convoy stayed put, and more SUVs arrived to reinforce them, leaving Victor Hale's central position vulnerable. With that vulnerability exposed, Ben took the next step of the plan, gathering a small team to move closer to the Iron Hawk's main hub, a newly built structure on the once-abandoned Fremont Ranch, hoping to uncover something that could expedite federal intervention once and for all. While Reggie's diversion played out, Ben led a covert squad of four, two of the newly deputized locals, plus a longtime rancher with keen tracking skills, along a series of ridges that offered a panoramic view of the Fremont Ranch. The place had changed dramatically in the past weeks. What was once a dilapidated property had been fortified with chain-link fencing, floodlights, and a watchtower fashioned out of repurposed scaffolding. Armed sentries patrolled at all hours, and Ben counted at least 6 men posted on the roof of the main building, each scanning the surrounding hills. Hunkered down behind shrubs and rocks, the team moved with caution, mindful that any misstep might alert the guards. From this vantage, Ben could glimpse the comings and goings of smaller vehicles, vans and trucks with plates partially obscured by mud. A pair of men wearing black jackets loaded mysterious crates onto a flatbed, while others piled into a truck that headed down a rear access road. Through binoculars, Ben spotted some distinct markings on the crates that matched Jessica's previous photos near the sawmill. This was likely more of the contraband they were trafficking. He took multiple pictures, zooming in to capture details. Suddenly, the rancher in their group, Dale Weaver, pointed to a wide section of the fence. A different group of workers had strung barbed wire atop it, and beyond that area, the ground had been cleared of brush. It looked like a small helipad, only a few meters across, but conspicuously neat for farmland. Could they be expecting a helicopter for a major shipment or a high-profile visitor? Ben's gut churned at the possibility. If the Iron Hawks were bringing in air support or receiving sensitive cargo, the threat level to Silver Hollow would spike dramatically. It was a jarring reminder that these weren't local bullies, but part of a sprawling criminal network with resources to spare. One of the deputized locals, a quiet man named Greg, who had once served as an Army intelligence officer, gestured for Ben to check the western edge of the property. A large patch of trees obscured the fence line, making it a blind spot for the watchers on the roof. If they needed to infiltrate or plan a raid, that cluster of pines might be their best bet. Ben mentally noted the coordinates, planning how they'd approach if the chance arose. They continued their silent observation for about an hour until the sound of vehicles departing the property suggested some shift change or a scheduled run. Satisfied they had enough intel for the moment, Ben signaled a cautious withdrawal. On the trek back, the group kept low, fully aware that a single reflective glint from a rifle scope could bring down enemy fire. By the time they reconnected with the rest of their allies, Reggie's diversion was still holding the bulk of the Iron Hawks at bay near the logging trail. The day had gone as planned, but the dire reality of the gang's growing infrastructure cast a long shadow. Sure, they were buying time for the federal cavalry to arrive, but each passing hour risked the Iron Hawks reinforcing or consolidating even more power. News traveled swiftly among the town's residents about Reggie's face-off at the logging trail and Ben's reconnaissance of the Fremont Ranch. At Harvey Goodwin's diner, the morning rush buzzed with anxious speculation. Some wondered if the Iron Hawks were planning a massive strike before the feds could show up. Others voiced hope that the FBI or DEA would swoop in any day now, ending the crisis. Harvey found himself brewing pot after pot of coffee as clusters of customers lingered to discuss the latest rumors rather than head straight to work. Sheriff Brooks appeared at the diner around noon, looking more haggard than usual. Dark circles under her eyes spoke to sleepless nights. She sat at a corner table with a stack of paperwork, nursing a cup of black coffee. Jessica Alvarez joined her, laptop open and phone constantly buzzing with updates. Jessica had tried contacting her FBI sources again, but all she received were polite acknowledgments and vague assurances that assets were being mobilized. Her frustration was palpable. She'd hoped that by now some official cavalry would have ridden into Silver Hollow, badges gleaming, to haul Hale away in chains. Instead, they got radio silence and stalling. It wasn't just the lack of federal support that gnawed at them. Commissioner Fletcher's office announced a new wave of inspections targeting non-compliant structures, a term that suspiciously encompassed every building owned by those supporting Margaret Ross. Paula Green's newly rebuilt general store was first on the list. Deputies acting under Fletcher's authority attempted to shutter it again, citing electrical hazards. But the local volunteer fire chief publicly vouched for Paula's wiring, creating a standoff that ended only when Sheriff Brooks intervened, invalidating Fletcher's paperwork on grounds of probable corruption. Across the diner, a group of ranchers huddled with Reggie and Dale Weaver, discussing the topography around Fremont Ranch. They mapped out possible infiltration routes, vantage points, and fallback positions, as if planning a miniature military operation. This marked a turning point. The townspeople were no longer just on the defensive. They were proactively preparing to disrupt the Iron Hawks' activities if forced into another confrontation. Reggie even floated the idea of disabling the helipad they suspected existed on the property. But Ben, who had just arrived, cautioned restraint. "Let's not do anything that could escalate to heavy casualties until we know for sure the feds are on the way," he said, clapping a hand on Reggie's shoulder. "We can't fight a full-scale war out here by ourselves." The tension in the diner was thick enough to slice with a knife, yet a quiet determination underpinned it. People understood that if they lost this battle, they'd lose more than farmland or shops. They'd lose the very fabric of their community. Each of them, in their own way, had decided it was better to stand together, even if it meant facing heavily armed criminals, than to let fear dictate their lives. As they finished their coffees and headed out to resume their duties, they shared a collective sense of grim purpose. One way or another, the Iron Hawk's grip on Silver Hollow would be broken. That evening, an unexpected call came through on the secure line Ben had set up using the sheriff's department's older radio frequency, one less likely to be compromised by state officials. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Agent Derek Landry from the FBI's Organized Crime Division, confirming that he was part of the team heading to Silver Hollow. "We're about 5 hours out," Agent Landry said. "It's a small, specialized task force. We've reviewed the evidence Ms. Alvarez sent, and we're treating this as a priority operation." Those words felt like a balm to the raw nerves that had plagued Ben and Sheriff Brooks for weeks. Finally, here was concrete assurance that the federal cavalry was en route. But Landry had a caveat. The Iron Hawks might have eyes on major roads, so the federal convoy would attempt a low-profile entry, possibly under cover of darkness. In other words, the citizens of Silver Hollow couldn't just throw a welcome parade. They needed to maintain the charade that no outside help was coming, lest Hale bunker down or flee with crucial evidence. Ben relayed the news to Margaret, whose lined face momentarily lit with relief. She sat at her kitchen table, gently tracing the rim of her teacup as Ben explained how they intended to coordinate with Agent Landry's task force. The plan was to use multiple entry points and then converge for a decisive raid on Fremont Ranch. With any luck, they'd catch Hale and his top lieutenants red-handed, plus secure the contraband stored there. If it all went smoothly, the operation could sever the Iron Hawks command structure and pave the way for arrests up the food chain. Word quietly spread among the volunteers that help was coming. For some, the news provided a jolt of optimism. For others, it fueled impatience. Reggie was among the latter. He'd been forging a close bond with the local defenders, teaching them basic tactical maneuvers. Many of these men and women had families, and each new day of danger weighed heavily on them. Reggie channeled their frustration into training exercises, running drills for securing perimeters or responding to gunfire. It was not a perfect solution, but it kept morale from collapsing under the relentless tension. Jessica Alvarez worked late into the night, compiling final documentation to hand over to Agent Landry. Her phone buzzed continuously with media inquiries, but she had decided to go dark until the raid was complete, not wanting to tip off the Iron Hawks by accident. On social media, she dropped hints that she was pursuing a major expose on corrupt land acquisitions, though she avoided specifics. Even so, the comment sections erupted with speculation, some praising her bravery, others calling it sensationalism. Amid this din of voices, Jessica maintained her focus, helping the FBI slam the door on Victor Hale's operation for good. Outside, the moon hung low, bathing the valley in pale silver light. Every so often, the roar of an engine broke the hush, prompting those on watch to raise their heads. They were hours from the final reckoning, but that last stretch often felt the longest. Tomorrow could bring deliverance or devastation, and each person at the Ross homestead braced for whichever came first. The following night arrived with a cold drizzle that slicked the roads and gave the pine trees a ghostly sheen. By 10 o'clock, most of Silver Hollow's lights were dimmed, as if the whole town tried to lie low until the federal team arrived. True to Agent Landry's word, unmarked vehicles began trickling in from multiple directions, north, east, and even from a decommissioned railway route. These cars carried a small contingent of FBI agents along with specialists from the DEA, well-versed in cartel takedowns. Their arrival went unnoticed by most, carefully orchestrated to avoid the Iron Hawk's watchful eyes. After rendezvousing at an old barn outside town limits, Agent Landry and his colleagues set up a temporary command center. The structure, once used for livestock auctions, now bristled with portable lighting, laptops, and communications gear. Sheriff Brooks arrived with Ben, Reggie, and Jessica, each providing on-the-ground intelligence. Landry's interest peaked when Reggie mentioned the suspected helipad behind Fremont Ranch. If they're capable of moving contraband by air, we can't let them slip away with any key evidence or big players, Landry stated, flipping through Reggie's hastily drawn sketches. As final plans took shape, Landry laid out the goal: a coordinated operation to neutralize the Iron Hawk's paramilitary force, secure the contraband, and arrest Hale and his lieutenants. Federal agents would hit the main building, while local volunteers and deputies under Sheriff Brooks would secure the perimeter and prevent any escape. Jessica would be embedded with an FBI media liaison, ensuring the raid was documented without endangering the operation. Margaret wisely would stay put on her farm with a volunteer guard. Given her age and the vantage points around her property, she stood the best chance of warning them if any Iron Hawks broke away and headed toward her land. Shortly after midnight, they initiated Phase 1. Under cover of darkness, the FBI's specialized vehicles fanned out along the county's back roads, their headlights off to remain inconspicuous. Reggie and Ben led small squads of locals to block likely escape routes around Fremont Ranch, using hay bales and old fences. By 2 a.m., all teams reported in, positions held, no signs of early detection. The operation was greenlit. That was when chaos erupted. Whether by pure coincidence or a mole within law enforcement, the Iron Hawk seemed to catch wind of the strike mere moments before it launched. On the drone feed, watched by Agent Landry and Jessica, bright headlights suddenly flooded the Fremont Ranch yard. Figures scrambled around, as if someone had sounded an alarm. Vehicles roared to life, some heading for the gates. Radio chatter spiked. Sheriff Brooks immediately called out to her deputies, directing them to intercept. Reggie signaled the volunteer squads to stand firm, reminding them that the feds were about to converge. "Go, go, go!" Agent Landry barked through his mic, and the hush of the Montana night exploded into sirens, shouted commands, and the pop of gunfire. The FBI task force raced toward the ranch, bulletproof vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters. The final confrontation had begun, and the outcome would hinge on whether the haphazard lines of local defenders and the precision of federal agents could unite seamlessly against a heavily armed, well-funded criminal empire. The Fremont Ranch courtyard transformed into a battlefield. Piercing beams from federal SUVs cut through the drizzle, silhouetting Iron Hawk's operatives as they darted for cover behind crates and vehicles. From the roof, muzzle flashes revealed gunmen firing sporadically at the advancing FBI teams. Agent Landry and a group of agents ducked behind a low cinder block wall, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. Their shouts of "Federal agents! Put your weapons down!" were answered by staccato rounds that ricocheted off metal siding. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brooks led a team of her most reliable deputies to seal the back exit. They used spike strips and barricades improvised from old fencing. 2 Iron Hawks trucks tried plowing through, only to swerve in a panic when confronted by the sheriff's flashing lights and the grid of half a dozen shotguns aimed at their windshields. One truck spun out, its tires shredding on the spike strip. The other reversed at full throttle, retreating into the chaotic ranch center. At the perimeter, Reggie's volunteer squads held position, rifles in hand, eyes scanning for any sign of flankers. They were no SWAT team, but weeks of drills in the defense of the Ross homestead had steeled their resolve. Whenever a figure tried to slip through the shadows, they'd shout for them to freeze. Most complied upon realizing they faced an entire line of armed locals determined not to lose their town to criminals. High above, a storm front rolled in, thunder rumbling like distant artillery. Lightning flashed, illuminating the property in stark bursts. Ben took advantage of one such flash to sprint forward, hooking around the main building to where the suspected helipad was located. Sure enough, a sleek dark helicopter stood idling, rotor blades beginning to spin. Two Iron Hawks tried to stop him, firing a volley of shots that whizzed by. Ben dropped to a knee, returned fire with precise aim, and forced them to duck behind barrels. Seizing the moment, he lobbed a tear gas canister at the chopper. Smoke hissed and enveloped the cockpit, sending the pilot scrambling to shut down the engine. Back in the courtyard, Agent Landry's team managed to push closer to the main building. Through night vision scopes, they spied Victor Hale on an elevated walkway, barking orders into a handheld radio. He appeared flustered, his usual smug composure replaced by wide-eyed urgency. Landry signaled for a tactical approach, using covering fire while two agents advanced up a flight of stairs. Hale's guards responded with a furious hail of bullets, forcing the agents to take cover. A stalemate formed, gunfire crackling in the cold air. Yet for all the Iron Hawks' bravado, the combined pressure from federal, local, and volunteer forces was unraveling their defenses. Hale's men had expected a smaller incursion, perhaps from the sheriff alone. Instead, they were being methodically squeezed in a pincer movement. The operation hung in a precarious balance, but the advantage was steadily tipping in favor of those who refused to let Silver Hollow be torn apart. As the firefight raged, Jessica Alvarez documented everything from behind a federal SUV parked near the ranch fence line. Camera rolling, she caught close-up shots of agents maneuvering in formation, Iron Hawks fleeing for cover, and overhead glimpses of swirling storm clouds punctuated by lightning. Her footage streamed to a secure server, ensuring that even if her equipment was destroyed, evidence of the raid would remain. The sound of gunshots and shouted orders mingled with the whistle of the wind, creating a cacophony that would have been unimaginable in the serene farmland a few months before. Over by the makeshift helipad, Ben saw an opportunity to secure the helicopter once and for all. The pilot was coughing in a cloud of tear gas, while two Iron Hawks scrambled to haul contraband from the craft's storage compartments. With the pilot occupied, the rotor blades began slowing, losing the momentum required to lift off. Ben, crouching low, dashed closer, mindful of the chemical-laden haze. He aimed his rifle at one of the gang members, fumbling with a duffel bag. "Drop it!" he shouted. The startled thug spun around, dropping the bag in mid-turn. It hit the ground with a metallic thunk, hinting at possible weapons inside. Just then, a third Iron Hawk, previously unseen, emerged from the darkness, firing at Ben in a desperate attempt to protect the helipad. Bullets clanged off the side of the helicopter, one grazing Ben's left arm. With adrenaline flooding his veins, he dove behind a fuel drum, ignoring the sharp sting in his bicep. He returned fire, and after a brief exchange, the hostile collapsed, wounded but alive. The helicopter pilot, disoriented, raised his hands in surrender, stumbling away from the craft. Ben exhaled shakily, pressing a gloved hand to his bleeding arm as backup arrived to secure the site. Across the ranch, Agent Landry's assault team closed in on Victor Hale's position. They advanced in tactical formation, pinned down momentarily by automatic bursts from the balcony. Hale paced frantically above them, radio pressed to his ear, clearly searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Most of his men had been neutralized, scattered, or were trading futile gunfire with the locals at the perimeter. In a final act of defiance, Hale ordered the men on the roof to lay down suppressive fire, presumably hoping to buy time to slip away through a hidden exit. Sheriff Brooks, coordinating through radio chatter, dispatched a second squad to circle behind the building. These deputies, joined by a few ex-military volunteers, forced open a back entrance, moving methodically through corridors. The place was littered with crates, half-packed boxes of ammunition, and scattered documents that hinted at the Iron Hawk's larger network. Each step deeper into the ranch house uncovered more evidence of the group's international ties. Phone logs referencing deals, ledgers marking shipments, and incriminating photos pinned to bulletin boards. If captured, these documents could bring down not just Hale, but everyone connected to his operations, including Commissioner Fletcher. Lightning flashed again, illuminating Hale's silhouette on the walkway. An FBI agent barked at him to surrender. Hale answered with another volley of bullets, but his aim was wild, an act of desperation rather than calculated aggression. A minute later, the agent's return fire shattered the railing near Hale's feet, sending wooden splinters flying. Hale staggered back, tossed his rifle aside, and threw up his arms, his face contorted with rage and defeat. Within seconds, agents rushed him, forcing him onto his stomach and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. The man who had terrorized Silver Hollow for months now lay mud-stained and powerless, the swirl of storm clouds mirroring the turbulence that had just ripped through his empire. With Hale's capture, the resistance from the remaining Iron Hawks splintered rapidly. Many simply surrendered, dropping their weapons once they realized their leader was in custody. Others attempted last-ditch efforts to flee, only to be intercepted by local volunteers at the perimeter. The final shots echoed across the Fremont Ranch as dawn's first light broke through thinning clouds, revealing a scene of utter disarray. Vehicles sat at haphazard angles, some with engines still running. Spent shell casings glinted in the mud, and the charred remains of tear gas canisters littered the grounds. Agent Landry's team moved with efficient purpose, securing the area and administering first aid where needed. Emergency medics, waiting in vehicles on a nearby road, swept in to triage the wounded, both among the Iron Hawks and the enforcement teams. Ben, having refused medical attention for his arm until the battle was over, finally allowed a medic to bandage his wound. Reggie patted him on the shoulder, relief in his eyes that his friend had escaped serious harm. Overhead, the storm clouds began to scatter, letting dawn rays spill over the battered ranch. Soon enough, Margaret Ross, accompanied by a few volunteers, arrived at the edge of the property. She had insisted on seeing for herself that the immediate threat was over. Sheriff Brooks greeted her, guiding her through the aftermath at a careful pace. Margaret's eyes roamed the damage, fences and structures riddled with bullets, crates of illegal goods strewn about, and rows of subdued Iron Hawks members, zip-tied and awaiting transport to custody. She wore a look that blended sadness and quiet resolve. This land, though not hers, was still part of Silver Hollow, and seeing it turned into a battlefield weighed heavily on her heart. Meanwhile, Jessica Alvarez conferred with Agent Landry in front of a hastily set-up FBI tent. "We've got enough evidence here to open major investigations in 4 other states," Landry remarked, flipping through a thick stack of newly unearthed documents. "Not to mention the potential international dimensions. Hale's not the only kingpin, but bringing him and his partners down will send shockwaves." Jessica nodded, a mixture of pride and weariness. She knew her reporting on the Iron Hawks would become even more significant now. But she also understood that the war against corruption wouldn't end in a single dawn. By mid-morning, a line of blacked-out federal vans rumbled in, ready to transport the detainees. Among them was Victor Hale, his face etched with fury, as 2 agents shoved him into a vehicle. He glared out the window, making brief eye contact with Margaret, who refused to flinch under his gaze. The old matriarch stood with remarkable poise, shotgun still clutched in her hands, an emblem of the steadfast courage she'd displayed from the start. The moment felt symbolic, as though the passing of Hale into federal custody marked the end of one chapter of Silver Hollow's ordeal. In the weeks that followed, Silver Hollow gradually emerged from the long shadow cast by the Iron Hawks. The FBI established a temporary field office in the county courthouse, sifting through piles of seized records. Names of crooked officials surfaced, and soon enough arrest warrants went out for Commissioner Fletcher and several of his associates in the state capitol. The public revelation of their involvement sparked a local political upheaval. Formerly timid voices now clamored for reform, fueled by both outrage and relief that the worst villains had been exposed. Margaret Ross returned to tending her farm, which bore its own scars from the conflict. Bullet-pocked barn walls, a front porch peppered with shrapnel. Neighbors swung by daily, offering to help patch fences, repaint splintered boards, and haul away debris. It became a communal effort, each person's hammer strokes or brush swipes symbolizing a collective desire to rebuild something stronger. One afternoon, a group of teenage volunteers, who once might have been found loitering by the gas station, arrived to restore Margaret's old chicken coop. She rewarded them with homemade lemonade and chocolate chip cookies, grateful beyond words for their spirit. Harvey Goodwin's diner buzzed with a different kind of energy. Gone was the anxious hush. In its place, animated chatter filled the booths. Conversations revolved around the eventual trials of Hale, Fletcher, and others implicated in the scandal. National reporters visited too, eager to capture first-hand accounts of how one small community rose against organized criminals. Harvey, for his part, proudly served up plates of scrambled eggs and hot coffee, telling each journalist the same thing. Silver Hollow folks stand by each other. That's all there is to it. Jessica Alvarez split her days between assisting federal investigators and polishing a detailed exposé for her news agency. Titled, "When a Town Says No More, The Silver Hollow Resistance," her piece chronicled not only the shootouts and political intrigue, but also the unsung bravery of everyday citizens. She highlighted how the real strength of the town emerged not from any single heroic figure, but from unity, a patchwork of determined individuals who refused to let intimidation curtail their way of life. Early drafts had media executives predicting award nominations, though Jessica shrugged off such praise, focusing instead on the story's impact. Ben Ross's arm wound healed steadily, a bandage the only trace of his close call. He stayed in Silver Hollow longer than he initially intended, using his remaining leave time to help Margaret fortify her home. Even Reggie lingered, forging friendships with many in the volunteer patrol. As for Sheriff Brooks, her department underwent a morale revival. Deputies who had once hesitated now stepped up to the challenge of protecting the county, free from the influence of crooked leadership. Federal liaisons acknowledged that, without Brooks's integrity, the Iron Hawks might have fully entrenched themselves long ago. By early winter, snow dusted the mountains and rooftops in town, a silent promise of seasons to come. The final criminal cases were underway, many of them reliant on evidence collected during those harrowing weeks. Each new indictment reinforced the lesson that criminals, even those backed by sizable cartels, could be defeated if a community stood firm. Looking out over her frost-kissed fields one morning, Margaret Ross felt an unburdened sense of peace. Though many trials lay ahead, both legal and personal, the darkest storm had passed, and the land she cherished stood resilient, much like the people who called Silver Hollow home. Looking back on this, it's clear that Silver Hollow's triumph wasn't about a single heroic act. It was the collective spirit of ordinary folks who stood firm against seemingly impossible odds. From a grandmother calmly defending her century-old farm, to a Navy SEAL who brought specialized skills home, and all the neighbors who wouldn't back down, this story shines as a testament to what unity and courage can accomplish. In my view, the greatest takeaway is that sometimes it takes a small community to remind the world how powerful we can be when we refuse to let fear dictate our lives. If this resonates with you, or if you have a different perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and let's continue the conversation. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more compelling stories together.